University. This week on Office Hours, the word fracking has entered the popular vocabulary as reports pile up on the promise and perils of the new method for extracting natural gas and oil. Duke biology professor and geochemist Robert Jackson, along with colleagues at the Nicholas School of the Environment, performed one of the first peer-reviewed studies on the environmental consequences of hydraulic fracturing. The study has been widely cited in both academic papers and news reports. In it, Jackson and his colleagues found methane contamination in well water near shale gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing sites. Jackson answers your questions about the controversy surrounding hydraulic fracturing.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. We have a wonderful discussion today about a topic that I think a lot of people have been very interested in with Rob Jackson from the Nicholas School for the Environment. We're going to talk today about hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, the practice of collecting natural gas from deep deposits by actually shattering the shale. Let me start with just a little bit by describing who you are and how you got to this, if you would help us with that. Every time I see you listed somewhere, Rob, you have sort of a different title. You're a biologist or you're a chemist or whatnot. But I gather that most of your career has been spent thinking about environment under the ground.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. I was trained originally as a chemical engineer. My first job was with the Dow Chemical Company. And then I went back to school in environmental sciences, and I spent most of the last 10 or 20 years looking at water issues, environmental chemistry, environmental sciences, and ecology.
Okay, good. So briefly describe to us what hydraulic fracturing is.
Hydraulic fracturing is one step in the process of getting gas out of, in this case, shale formations. So the first step is just drilling itself. And typically in a well nowadays, a company might drill down a mile and then drill outwards a mile or even 2 miles in what's called a horizontal drill. And the reason for doing that is you're drilling through a shale formation that might only be a couple hundred feet thick. So once the drilling has occurred, then companies use water injected underground at very high pressures to crack open that shale and allow the gas that's held in tiny pores in that rock to flow back to the well. So that second step is actually hydraulic fracturing, but it's only part of the process.
And these drilling rigs are pretty impressive. They go 5,000 to say 7,000 feet down, and then are able to turn 90 degrees, basically.
The technology is remarkable. I mean, both hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling have been around for some time. Hydraulic fracturing going back 50 years or more. But the combination of 3D imaging below ground through seismic approaches and the precision with which they can go through these layers is quite remarkable.
So tell us now about being somebody who's interested in the environment underground and knowing that this new method of gas collection is going on. What brought you to this study, and what was it you actually studied?
Well, I was already studying groundwater issues associated with carbon capture and storage. I have a grant with a fellow colleague, Avner Vengosh, who's also whose lab is a major part of this work. And we were already doing incubations thinking about how, in this case, carbon dioxide might change the chemistry of water. And I kept reading and hearing about hydraulic fracturing and shale gas extraction. And when I went to look at that, I couldn't find any peer-reviewed studies at all. So it was the need for some good data in an area where there's a lot of emotion and anecdote that led us to do this work.
Okay, so you went to northeastern Pennsylvania, a formation called the Marcellus Shale.
Right. So the Marcellus formation is one of, if not the biggest shale formation in the United States, typically 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 feet underground. We went there and contacted homeowners and sampled wells, water wells in individual homes in the area.
What was your sampling method? How did you know which houses to look at and which ones to ignore?
Well, we didn't intentionally ignore any of them. The way we went about it was to contact people through homeowner associations and such. It's very hard to get a truly random sample. We can only go into homes where people tell us yes, obviously. But through homeowner associations and personal contacts and phone and such, we built a network of people whose homes we visited. And we're still building that network now. We've been back many times since our first paper came out, and hundreds of homes.
You must have encountered quite a range of reactions in these individual homeowners. I bet some of them are great with it because they're getting a lot of royalties, and some of them dislike it intensely.
No, the range of experiences, the stories that you hear from people, That's by far the most interesting part of this work, in addition to the science. I mean, there are people who are very happy with what's happened. I mean, the money that can accompany the shale gas for the mineral rights and everything, it's been it's changed some people's lives. There are dairy farmers we've talked to who are able to hold on to their land, really in a positive way. On the other hand, there are people, many people who have felt disenfranchised. There have been spills across property, people who've had trouble with their water. So we really do see every stage on the spectrum of responses to this. And I think that captures really why this is such an important but also a divisive topic.
Yeah. Are the royalties paid only to the homeowner who has the wellhead, or do they also pay the person 2 miles away who's actually at the end of the pipe?
A company has to assemble a drilling lease that goes all the way along the horizontal drill.
Yeah.
So it's not just for the homeowner with the wellhead. That homeowner typically gets a bit more money.
Yeah. So we have some pictures of what you were doing, and basically after talking to the homeowner, getting their permission to participate, you and your students were drawing off their tap water, as close to the well as you could get?
That's right. We, in many cases, would sample the well that right where it came out of the ground. And it's important to say that we focused on private water wells, as I have in my house here in North Carolina, because people on municipal water sources in cities and towns, their water is tested regularly.
Yeah.
But if you're on a private water well, as I am, no one tests my water unless I pay for someone to do it. Mm-hmm. So we contacted homeowners, sampled water as near to the wells as we could before any water treatment, water softeners and things like that. Tested some things in the field and then brought that water back to the lab to do additional tests.
And was there any pre-testing done in the wells? It was just when you showed up after the gas wells were in place that you were able to do this?
Well, some of the homes that we sampled, there was not any drilling in them before. Some there had been. We couldn't turn back the clock and get a pre-drilling sample for every house. That would be the perfect way to do this kind of sampling.
Yeah.
So some of our homes now that we sampled as a baseline are about to be drilled or soon to be drilled. So we have a building baseline. But we took just visited houses as randomly as we could across the area.
And again, this is one of the first studies of its kind, right? There isn't a lot of benchmarking that's been done about pre-existing water conditions or about what's going on with the drinking water around a fracking operation.
That's right. This is one of the things that was so surprising about this to me and to us is that there hadn't been, to our knowledge, any other studies looking at water quality. And I think the unique thing about what we did was to ask what difference, if any, it made if you were near or far from a gas well. So we organized our sampling around how near the gas wells were.
Okay. And your findings in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple months ago now were quite shocking to people. In a nutshell, what did you find?
Well, what we didn't find was any evidence for fracturing fluids or deep water from underground. This is one of the biggest fears that people have because of the chemicals that are found in fracking fluids, organic such as benzene, xylene, toluene, in some cases diesel. So we weren't able to look for all of those ourselves, but we looked for some of them. We looked for isotopic evidence, even radioactivity that can occur naturally. We didn't find any of that. So that's a good news. That's a good news situation. What we did find, though, was a very strong relationship between how near you were as a homeowner to a gas well and the concentration of gases such as methane and ethane in your water. Methane's the primary constituent of natural gas. And we found that if you were within about a kilometer or 2/3 of a mile of a gas well, you were far more likely to have very high methane concentrations, and in some cases, dangerously high.
Now, how do you know that methane wasn't in their water already?
Well, the perfect way to know that would be to have a pre-drilling test and then to go back and sample again. Because we weren't able to do that for a number of these houses at the first testing, we used chemical signatures, what you might call stray gas forensics. So we analyzed the chemistry of the gas, particularly the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and compared that to gas that's found naturally in shallow layers, that's typically generated by microbes, versus the signatures, the isotopic signatures of gas that comes out of wells. And when we did that, we found that in many cases where we had high concentrations of gas, that gas looked a lot like what's found deep underground in these shale layers.
So it had an isotopic signature that indicated that it was deep methane rather than higher up methane.
That's right.
What would be the depth of a drinking water well typically in this area?
I mean, a typical drinking water well might be anywhere between 50 and about 300 feet.
Okay, so you're talking about 300 feet for the water and 5,000 to 7,000.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Right. There's a long distance, a long vertical distance between the two.
how does this deep methane end up in that shallow aquifer? How did that happen?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, we were very careful in our paper, and since then, to say quite clearly that we don't know. We don't have all the data that we need, and to be quite honest, we don't have access to the wells themselves, the gas wells, to be able to look at that. We think that the most likely explanation is leaks in the casing, essentially in the tubing and cement and such that protects the water in shallow layers from the gas that's coming up from underground. It's possible, less likely, but possible that gas could be migrating up through fractures in the rock, and possibly that the process of hydraulic fracturing could open fissures, not necessarily all the way to the surface or to the water, but high enough up that gas could migrate through natural fissures. Less likely than leaks in the casings, though.
In that latter example, if the fracking were causing fissures that went all the way up to the 300-foot depth, why wouldn't the fracking fluids be traveling in those same fissures?
Well, for a couple reasons, possibly they could, depending on things. But the pressures that it would take, that it would require to lift that water, would be fairly high. Methane and ethane are a gas, so they're buoyant compared to a liquid. So it's much easier for a gas to travel upwards, especially through water, than it is for water to travel upwards, and that water needs to mix through other aquifers in intermediate layers. So I get asked the question a lot: is finding methane in someone's water a harbinger or an early warning signal of finding the fracking fluids? Possibly, but certainly not necessarily.
Okay. We have a question from our online audience. Andrew has written you to ask about the YouTube videos of people setting their tap water on fire. They seem to be clear evidence of contamination. In the last study, you concluded that more research was necessary. So what level of evidence would you require to commit to the idea that contamination has definitely occurred in people's drinking water?
Well, I think it depends in part on contamination of what. I think contamination of methane, the fact that we have such a strong relationship between how near people are to a gas well and the concentrations of methane and ethane, I'm pretty convinced, based on our first paper and also on a lot of follow-up work that we've done since then, that we were right, that there are methane coming out in some cases into people's water that's associated with drilling. For fracturing fluids, which is not well proven at all and may not be occurring anywhere that we're working, what you really need to find is signatures of particular chemicals, such as a benzene or diesel or ethylene glycol, or to use a tracer, which some companies do now, put a tracer into the fracking fluids and see if you can find that tracer in low concentrations. It's actually really hard to prove contamination of fracking fluids, though. If we go to a home and a homeowner finds ethylene glycol in their water, that could be from a hydraulic fracture that's occurred recently, but there are other sources of ethylene glycol in the environment around them.
Could be a leaking radiator by the wellhead.
Could be many other things.
Yeah.
So proving a leak like that is quite difficult.
Isn't it also part of the problem that the energy companies don't disclose what's in their secret sauce, that you don't actually know what you're looking for in a fracking fluid, and they all use different recipes?
Well, that's true. There is a move towards full disclosure of what's in fracking fluids, and I think that full disclosure is a great idea for several reasons. It will put pressure on companies to use fewer and less toxic chemicals. It makes our job easier when we're trying to track those chemicals in the environment. There are some health safety issues for workers if spills occur and such. So states really are driving that change right now, states such as Wyoming, Colorado, Texas to some extent. And I think we'll have full disclosure rules. And most of the industry people I talk to agree that that's a good idea, with the possible exception of being particular chemicals that they consider to be trade secrets.
Yeah. I asked because we now have a question from Stuart by email. Isn't it amazing that fracking fluids in the U.S. are exempt from regulation? Companies are allowed to treat the composition of the fluids as trade secrets. There's little information on what they contain and what risks they might present. I guess I already asked Stuart's question for him.
Well, in terms of the word exemption is a controversial word, but groundwater in particular is unusual because the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't regulate groundwater in any way. The exemption is a contentious term, but there's no reason for us not to be promoting full disclosure and to be promoting recycling of fracking fluids so that there's less waste generated and less potential pollution. Everybody wins.
They don't recycle the fluids now?
Well, companies are starting to, but traditionally no. When the 5 million or so gallons of fracking fluids that are typically injected into a well come back up, perhaps 1, 2, 3 million of those gallons, plus some naturally briny, very salty water. That water is re-injected underground somewhere else, typically. In some states, it's gone to municipal water treatment plants, which is, in my opinion, not the right thing to do at all. So cutting down the wastewater that comes back from these wells and using that water to frack the next well is a good idea for everyone.
So in a rural area where there are no wastewater treatment plants, what are they doing? Deep well injection?
They are, but in some states it's not legal to inject water deep underground. Here in North Carolina, we're an example of that. In Pennsylvania, what they've been doing recently, where we've been working, is shipping their waste to states such as Ohio. And interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, Ohio just quadrupled their rates for I believe out-of-state disposal. So there's a lot of moving around of that waste in the area.
Scooter asks a great question via Twitter. Does fracking cause earthquakes?
Does fracking cause earthquakes? There's pretty clear evidence, in my opinion, that fracking causes microseismic activity. So there have been cases in Arkansas and Texas in particular where very small tremors have occurred down in the range of sort of 2 to 3, perhaps as high as 4. I don't know of any case where hydraulic fracturing has caused what people would consider an earthquake that they could feel, with one possible exception in Arkansas. So microseismic, yes. Full-scale earthquakes, probably not.
Yeah. So your findings that methane from deep sources was appearing in drinking water wellheads close to the gas wellheads, maybe not as much further away, caused quite a storm. And some people were upset that you didn't find the fracking fluid. Some people were upset that you did find the methane. And I think I heard you say the other day, everybody was unhappy with this study.
Well, industry praised our result for not finding fracking fluids and lambasted us for the conclusion about methane and ethane. Some environmental groups praised us for finding the methane and ethane, and then lambasted us for saying that we didn't find the fracking fluids when we didn't look for every chemical constituent and such. Yeah. So everybody was a little bit unhappy with our result. Yes.
Yeah. There have been a round of letters now to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I've had 2 people ask about it so far. I have not read the letters. I hope you have. What do you make of that kind of response in the academic journal?
Well, the natural academic process is always to probe and to think about how we can do this sort of research better. So some of the points that have been raised in general and in those letters include the sample size of our study, which the initial study was 68 homes, or now triple or more of that. The issue that's already come up of not having pre and post drilling data, which would be ideal. The fact that there is natural, what we call thermogenic gas in the area. So thermogenic gas is what's found deep underground, formed under high heat and pressure, with no microbes, no biology involved, compared to methane that's generated by microbes near the surface. Mm-hmm. There are historical pockets of high methane in Pennsylvania and other areas. So we've done a lot of work to try and differentiate, to distinguish between that shallow methane and that deep methane. So some people have suggested, including one of those letters, that there's thermogenic methane everywhere in the area. That means what we're finding is natural. There is thermogenic methane in the area, or mixed gas, but it does not look like the gas we find at very high concentrations, and it does not match the gas coming out of the wells. So I don't believe that's the cause.
Were you able to do isotopic analysis on the gas that the energy company was actually producing to compare?
So we didn't do the isotopic analyses on the gas itself because we don't have access to those samples. But the state of Pennsylvania, for instance, and other people have done those analyses, and we were able to match up those signatures to particular wells in the areas where we were sampling.
Okay, so there was a match made. It wasn't part of your paper.
So there was. Well, we included those data in our paper just to show a plot of here's what the gas looks like coming out of the wells. Here's what our gas looks like from homeowners, and then a range of sites where concentration is lower that were a lot farther away from that sweet spot of what's coming out of the gas wells.
So on the other end of the response to this, you have environmentalists who feel strongly that fracking is just not a good idea, and they too were upset with your findings.
Well, it's a difficult issue. I think one of the reasons that hydraulic fracturing and shale gas extraction, and really oil and gas extraction in general, is so contentious is that people care about their water. There's something visceral about the safety of your water. And again, if you're on a private well and no one's testing your water, or if something happens to one of your children, for instance, maybe that coincides with a drill that's near you. Maybe it has something to do with that drill. Maybe it doesn't. But it's difficult when you have to worry about the quality of your water, even if there's nothing wrong with your water. So I think that more than anything else creates a sense of unease about this process.
Good news. Somebody named Wilson Energy says, hey, not everyone is unhappy. Your approach has been a model for science on thorny environmental issues.
So thank you very much.
Kudos for that. And I understand there's been some European response to this as well. You just got back from a trip to Europe to give some expert testimony?
So I was in Brussels. There was a hearing at the European Commission. The European Commission is the sort of the body for the European Union that's thinking about policies across countries. We had commissions and commissioners from a couple of them. There are 27 in the EU overall, energy, environment, and climate, and their staff was at this hearing. And really, Europe is trying to figure out what to do, just like the state of North Carolina is. France recently banned hydraulic fracturing in May of this year. Poland, which has one of the largest resources in shale gas, is forging ahead quite rapidly, and every country in between. Poland's a fascinating example because, of course, most of Poland's gas comes from essentially a single pipeline from Russia. So not only are there environmental issues, but there are probably more important geopolitical issues associated with the decision like the one that Poland has taken.
Yeah. That kind of segues to an important point, I think, that discussions about fuel sources like this are not binary. If you're not going to be using natural gas to heat your home or to produce electricity, you're going to use perhaps coal. And that's not, there are trade-offs in everything, right? So natural gas is actually a decent fuel. It doesn't have particulates. It produces less CO2, BTU for BTU.
That's right.
So there's some advantages to it. It's domestic, which is always argued that it's, although that's kind of a false argument because we don't heat our homes with oil. But suffice it to say, I heat my home with gas. I own automobiles. We all consume this stuff. I don't think it's quite fair to just say, no, you can't produce a certain kind of material.
I mean, in my life, my house is heated with coal. My car is oil. My stove is gas. So we're surrounded by fossil fuels. I think this is one of the reasons why the question I get asked repeatedly is, why do I not call for a ban on hydraulic fracturing and shale gas extraction? And the reason for that, first of all, is that there's still a tremendous amount we need to know, and there are clearly a lot of wells that are drilled that where there aren't problems. Yeah. But the real reason is the issue that you raise: is where else will our energy come from if we slam the door shut on a resource such as this? If it comes from wind, that's one thing. If it comes from mountaintop mining, and the pollution, the millions of tons of waste a year that we get from coal, I think gas looks pretty good compared to mountaintop mining and pulverized coal for electricity. So we have to think about our whole energy portfolio in this country, the environmental effects, the security issues surrounding that, financial issues. And if you argue for natural gas as a bridge to a renewable future, then I think that's an argument worth making, worth discussing.
But that said, energy companies have a long track record of exploiting resources quickly and cheaply and maybe leaving the damage for others to deal with. If I lived in a rural area where this was going on and they were using deep well injection, I would be highly concerned. I mean, a mile underground sounds like a lot, but it's benzene and all kinds of other stuff. And they're just, when that well is played out, they're gone, right?
Mm-hmm. I've had a lot of discussions and interactions with people in industry. We went and talked to industry before our paper came out, because the drilling companies, the energy companies obviously they know the most about these kinds of processes. I think in my mind, the problems that have occur when companies get in a hurry. And I think companies are no different than people in the sense that when I get in a hurry, I'm more likely to make a mistake when I do something. And there's a tremendous amount of pressure on drilling rigs and the facilities in Pennsylvania and elsewhere to move that equipment along to the next well. Mm-hmm. I think when people get in a hurry, they make mistakes, and best management practices are excellent, and industry has made a lot of strides in improving those. But if they're not followed, and if there aren't enough inspectors to assure that those best management practices and the regulations are followed, then corners get cut and mistakes get made. And where we found contamination, I think that's probably what's happened.
There's so little data of the kind of study that you did. It's not hard to imagine that the energy companies are well ahead of the regulators at this point.
Well, I think they are. The energy companies have the best data sets in the world. And one of the frustrations for me, to be quite honest, are criticisms of our work that say the sample size is too small, you don't have the pre and post drilling data, things like that. That's frustrating for me because industry has those data, but it's very difficult to get your hands on those data.
Yeah.
So we've repeatedly called for better data taking, but also better disclosure of that information. In the state of Pennsylvania, for instance, there's something called a presumptive liability rule, where if you're within 1,000 feet of a drilling operation and you have a problem with your water, the company's presumed guilty until they can show otherwise. And why that's a great rule is that it fosters companies taking well samples in people's homes, so you get that pre-drilling baseline. Pennsylvania has just proposed expanding that distance to 2,500 feet, consistent with one of our recommendations. So better information is always good, but getting your hands on that information is not easy.
Yeah. Tim asks by email, Robert asks by email, are there any studies planned in New York involving pre-drilling groundwater samples in order to provide a baseline?
There absolutely are, and the context for this question is that the state of New York has had a moratorium on essentially horizontal drilling and especially hydraulic fracturing beyond a threshold of about 80,000 gallons. Mm-hmm. So you can fracture a well vertically with 80,000 gallons in some cases, but you can't do a long horizontal drill. So it's been an effective ban in the state for shale gas. Governor Cuomo recently announced that ban will be lifted with some exceptions. The watershed in the Catskills that supplies New York will be exempted. The watershed that supplies Syracuse will be exempted, but most of the Marcellus will be opened up. So we have a proposal to do measurements there. I know other groups are considering that, and we've already taken some samples there in our initial study as part of a baseline.
Okay, good. Tim asks, now we get to Tim, are there parallel studies that show that the groundwater would have been contaminated anyways, regardless of the fracking that was done in the area?
So I'm not entirely sure I understand that question. Is it I don't know if the
Well, there's another paragraph here.
Right.
The point being, that some areas that have had groundwater or drinking water contamination would have happened anyway due to nature or other man-made factors.
Okay, so there may be perhaps two contexts then for that question. There's a very real question of whether hydraulic fracturing causes a contamination. And this gets mixed in, so people use the term hydraulic fracturing now for the whole shale gas extraction process. And it's quite possible, and likely in some cases, that you get a leak in a casing that may have nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing itself. If the question is, do I think what we're finding is just natural variation? I don't think so.
Because of the isotopic analysis and because of the distribution
Because of a
around
whole
the
host
wellhead.
of factors,
Yeah.
including those things, yes.
Okay.
And just because of more and more data that we have available to us. I don't think it's random chance.
Okay. Twitter user LizAdams44 asks, what are the best policies for local governments to enact to detect and prevent this kind of water contamination?
So we've made a whole series of recommendations really since our first paper came out. One example of recommendations was an op-ed that I wrote with an associate, Stephen Osborne, that ran in the Raleigh News and Observer. The Charlotte Observer came out a couple months ago. And this op-ed, the title was something like, Why Pigs and Drilling Rigs Are Alike. And the idea behind our piece was that we had 10 million pigs on the ground here in North Carolina before many people stopped to think about what it might do for air and water. And consequently, rules and regulations lag behind problems that were already in place. And essentially, we're still paying the cost for some of those problems because of legacy effects.
Yeah.
So what we said was, let's get this right for shale gas in North Carolina if the state legalizes it. So some of the things we've recommended include, not surprisingly for scientists, good data collection before, during, and after drilling, protecting homeowners through aggressive setbacks and zoning, how far your house could be from a well, schools, and other water sources for towns, disclosure of fracking fluids, and really a very important one to think now about where the water for hydraulic fracturing will come from and where the wastewater will go, and encouraging recycling of that wastewater.
5 million gallons is not a trivial amount of water.
It's a lot of water. On the other hand, other things we do use a lot of water, such as agriculture and such. So it's a lot of water. It's a lot of wastewater, and anything we can do to minimize or reduce the amount of wastewater is a positive step.
Yeah. So for a state like North Carolina where this hasn't happened yet, they ought to be thinking about the water and the fracking fluids, the casings. Are there regulations about what your casing has to be?
There certainly are. Using Pennsylvania as an example again, where we've worked, they just strengthened their casing and other rules in February of this year. Okay. And that was before the more recent suggestion to strengthen their Oil and Gas Act overall. So there are absolutely regulations. And in some cases, there are companies that go beyond those regulations. It's not always people doing just the minimum either.
Okay. We have just crossed the half-hour mark, so we'll start to wrap up here. I wanted to ask you where you're going to go next with this. I understand you have some new equipment in your lab now for looking for more of the constituents of the fracking fluid. Are you still sampling in Pennsylvania, or are you going elsewhere?
We are. We're still sampling in Pennsylvania. We've been back many times since our first study came out. We are plan to sample New York. We are setting up literally right now through study designs a baseline sampling for North Carolina in case shale gas and hydraulic fracturing are legalized here. We are working with the U.S. Geological Survey in Arkansas, so we have a parallel study that we've done there and have our first results back from that. And then in a new vein of our research is to think about the fate of methane and some of those gases. How much of those gases might actually make it to the atmosphere? Yeah. Methane's a potent greenhouse gas, far stronger than carbon dioxide. Methane interacts with other pollutants such as nitrogen oxides to form ozone. So we've bought a new instrument that allows us to look for high pockets, high concentrations of methane, and in real time to see what the isotopic signatures of that gas is, to see if it's deep gas or shallow gas. So the difference, say, between a natural gas pipeline and a sewer.
Mm-hmm. A Twitter question with no name attached asks, have you asked the energy companies for access to the well samples and the casing data?
We have asked the companies for that. We've not thus far been very successful in getting any information, which is a bit of a source of frustration. On the other hand, as I mentioned, when I work for the Dow Chemical Company, I know what it's like to work in a litigious environment and even to work in some situations where a company gets accused of doing something that it didn't do. But I have to say there are a lot of data in industry hands, and I would like to see industry be more forthcoming in making those data available.
Have you approached the energy industry for funding for these kinds of research?
We have not. We made a decision in the beginning not to do that. We could have done that. The first question I get asked when I walk into a home is, who's paying for your study? And if the answer to that question is industry, right or wrong, they don't want anything to do with it, or they don't trust the result that you give. So we've made a decision not to accept private money of that sort, and I think it's been the right decision.
How has this been funded so far?
This was funded originally by a private donation to the Nicholas School of the Environment, not targeting shale gas, but just a general donation. We have different grant proposals in now, foundations. We have some money from the National Science Foundation. This is with Ebner Vengosh and Erica Weinthal to hold a workshop that will occur in Duke this fall and then again next year. So different sources.
Okay. The comments are still coming in, but we're at 35 minutes now. Suffice it to say, we could do this all day. People are asking about all kinds of things like the overall energy picture. Isn't it true what so-and-so said, that there was baseline data, et cetera? I would encourage people to just keep talking about this. This video will stay online. You can continue to post to our Facebook page as this discussion goes forward. Professor Jackson is always on the web. You can find the papers, you can read the white papers, you can read the question and answer document that's been written about this issue, and we look forward to seeing more data and more papers. We're clearly not done with this topic.
No, we're certainly
yet.
not. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks for joining us today.
Bye-bye.